This may be a country that was built by immigrants, yet it has always had an uneasy relationship with them. Replace words like Mexican, Chinese, and Bangladeshi with Irish, Italian, and Jewish, and you'll hear the conversations in New York City a century ago. The very same scorn, hate, and racist invective heaped today on immigrants, legal and illegal, were dumped on the forebears of today's native-born mainstream. So what underpins this hostility? I'd say fear, in no small part. Fear of competition, fear of change, fear of the unknown, all of which our journalism can go some ways toward mitigating. Because by rendering immigrants as they are, as human beings with the same range of emotions, desires, and motivations as everyone else, you make your readers, your viewers, your listeners connect with them on a human level. Rendering immigrants, and I mean rendering them honestly in all their complexities, the good and the bad, the lawful and the criminal, we come to better understand the place where we live, the place that this country is becoming. This may seem an obvious point. We report so others can understand the world we live in. After all, it's why we do our job. But I think it bears repeating in the context of immigration, because so often the individual and the textures that make up the immigrant experience get lost in the swirl of rhetoric. While I don't write about the national debate too often, as I said, I must remain attentive to those currents. I may not be writing about political gamesmanship on Capitol Hill surrounding comprehensive immigration reform, or about the Obama administration's shift toward focusing enforcement efforts on employers, but I need to keep those debates in mind for context, just as I need to stay attuned to foreign affairs and what's unfolding in the so-called sending countries abroad. Because what happens in Swat Valley in western Pakistan or in Puebla, Mexico, can impact in ways big and small what's happening in Jackson Heights, Queens, or in East Harlem. So, as the temperature of the debate has heated up, the tone has gotten nastier, the nation more divided on the issue, and this behooves us as journalists, as human beings, to stay focused on the fact that we're talking about human beings, to write about immigrants not as symbols or cliches, but as people who are trying to make it through the day and make a buck and fend off sadness, just like everyone else. I spoke to a room full of journalists the other day at Columbia University, and a student came up to me afterwards, after my presentation, and she had read a selection of my stories that had focused on the Chinese diaspora in New York City. Each story provided a different view of the community, and she said she had never thought of immigration coverage in terms of the color and textures of immigrant life. It's then that I realized I'd taken my approach for granted. To me, the legislative stuff, the debate on Capitol Hill, the enforcement stories, it's all very important, but for the kind of stuff that really moves me, it's just an overlay. I prefer to view the question of immigration through the lenses of culture, economics, family, society, language, cuisine, and crime. So, what do you cover? Let your conversations, your curiosities, and your discoveries inform you. Again, I try to explore the granular nature of everyday life lived at the street level, among the immigrant rich and the immigrant poor. That's where, to my mind, the best stories are, where conflict and drama are most palpable, indeed tangible. Also, I've tried to keep New York in mind. I don't want to write stories were I to replace the words New York City with, say, Rochester. It would otherwise remain the same. I mean, what are my stories saying about the uniqueness of New York City? How could something only be happening there? What's uniquely New York about this particular issue that I'm focusing on? It's a hard mark to hit every time, and I probably fail far more times than I succeed, but I try. And I think this should actually be a goal of every local reporter everywhere, whether writing about immigration or anything else. So in practice, what do I mean by all of this? Well, by way of example, I'll show you or tell you about what I've done with the Chinese population, and the same group of stories that Columbia University student read. I mean, oftentimes reporters and their editors, and especially their editors, think of done that group and they should move on. And my response to that is, this isn't the Eurovision Song Contest, one song per nation. I'm trying to find compelling, interesting, surprising stories wherever they are and tell them to the paper's readers. I'm lucky to have an employer who supports me in this endeavor and supports me with space. I mean, obviously, we're all suffering a lack of space, and it's never enough space, but it's space nonetheless. And they allow me to go back again and again to the same communities and neighborhoods, digging deeper and trying to render them in all their complexity. I've written about a fundraising effort among local Chinese groups after that huge earthquake in 2008. What was interesting about that effort, I thought, was that local anti-communist Chinese groups had suspended their animosities toward the Chinese government for the purpose of humanitarian assistance, and it peeled a layer back on an otherwise fairly opaque neighborhood and community. And it was one of my first forays into the Chinese community. On the occasion of the Beijing Olympics, I wrote about the role of sports in Chinese immigrant society and explored a divide between assimilated immigrant families and those who weren't particularly assimilated in how they regard the role of sports in society. I've profiled the community of street artists in Times Square in an attempt to peel back that layer of anonymity that obscures them. One story I wrote described the eclipse of Cantonese by Mandarin and how that paralleled migratory, social, and political shifts within the diaspora. I've also written about the lively Chinese newspaper sector in New York City, the Chinese language newspaper sector, about a series of robberies that struck the little-known underworld of illegal mahjong parlors, and about the surge in the size of the Asian population and the political implications of that growth. And following a bus crash, this might be my favorite story so far on the Chinese diaspora, following a bus crash last spring that killed a number of passengers, many of them Chinese immigrants. I profiled one of the victims, a restaurant worker who would otherwise have probably lived a totally anonymous life. I felt that if, in telling his story about how he was smuggled from Fujian province for $75,000, a debt that he was far from paying off when he died, and then toiled in New York City to support his family back home and lived this banal, tedious, exhausting life in New York, I was somehow telling the basic story of so many of his countrymen in New York. I've written about Chinese investment in New York City, about the vibrant underground market in homemade rice wine, and about a Chinese guy who arrived in this country, and you heard reference to this earlier, about 10 years ago with no money and no English, who built a cell phone accessories empire from scratch that has made him millions and millions of dollars, yet he still doesn't speak English. All these stories sought to shed some light on what to many people seems like a highly amorphous, homogeneous community, the Chinese, when in fact it is one of the most complex societies in the city and so difficult to understand, especially by somebody like me who speaks a grand total of 2 Chinese phrases. The point is, the digger you dig, the more stuff you'll find to write about, and the more you humanize the population in the eyes of everyone else. In any immigrant community, there are as many stories to write as there are people. There are great stories of immigration fraud, with immigrants as both perpetrators and victims. Indeed, if we're going to strive for a fair representation of immigrant life, and you've heard me say this already before, you must also recognize that immigrants aren't always the victim. They are, by definition, strivers and survivors, and many have figured out ways to work and twist and exploit the system to their advantage. So explore the gray zones. Little in this world is simply black and white. So there are great stories ready to be written about immigrant crime, organized crime, gangs, drug trafficking, counterfeiting, and complex human smuggling rings. I would hazard to say even here in Rochester. There are stories about assimilation and about resistance to assimilation. Look for the reflections and impacts of events abroad on life here. For in this interconnected, wired, globalized world, the earth has shrunk and immigrant diasporas are more closely tied to their countries of origin than ever before. In fact, one of my favorite stories I've written so far on this beat was a piece from 2009 entitled A Dispute Half a World Away Darkens a Movie House in Queens, I got a tip from someone that a popular local movie theater in Jackson Heights, which is an area of Queens, that had once been a porn cinema, had closed, and there was a sign on it that said something like "closed because of a strike." So I looked into it. This was a theater, a movie theater that showed first run and second run Bollywood films, but mainly first run Bollywood films for the entertainment of the Jackson Heights neighborhood, which has lots of South Asians. The resulting story began like this. A surge at the box office has made this spring a surprisingly happy one for the movie business. And as the big summer films arrive, Americans are expected to pile into theaters in even greater numbers. Yet at one little cinema in Jackson Heights, Queens, the plot line is not so happy. It's a little corny, but bear with me, okay? The Eagle Theater is shut tight, its steel burglar gate pulled down, and its marquee blank, battered and dark. The cause of the theater's untimely closing, like many things that happen in this bustling immigrant neighborhood, lies not in New York, but here on the other side of the planet. In Mumbai, India, a 7-week-old strike by film producers has brought Hollywood, that country's multi-billion-dollar film industry, to a halt. And as I explained, this theater specializes in first-run Bollywood movies, and then without the supply of new films, that the theater and theaters like it around the world were having to shutter. So I went to the neighborhood and interviewed some people, and there was this character named Muhammad Asif, and he manages the Eagle, and he said, "You get more frustrated when you have no say in it. We're not part of their problem, but we're affected." Now that principle you could apply to so many events overseas and the effect that they have on the local manifestations of their international diaspora. Immigrants are affected in ways big and small by events clear on the other side of the planet. This is a theme you can explore again and again. There are also great business stories in immigrant communities. Numerous studies have shown that foreign-born adults in the United States start businesses at significantly higher rates than native-born adults. And don't ignore the fascinating internal dynamics within immigrant families where generations sometimes push against one another with the rapid assimilation of the second generation into American society, so often putting children at loggerheads with their parents. There are also fascinating tensions created by different legal statuses within the same family. My colleague David Gonzalez wrote an amazing story a couple of years ago that explored the issue of families in which some members had legal status and others didn't. It was an Ecuadorian family that allowed him and a photographer to trail them for months. And the family is part of this, of a group of so-called mixed status families. Nearly 2.3 million undocumented families, about three-quarters of those who are here illegally, have at least one child who is a United States citizen, David reported. Nearly 400,000 of them have both citizen and non-citizen children. And as their numbers rise, he wrote, they are challenging the most stubborn stereotypes of 21st century immigrants, that they fit neatly into separate groups, legal or illegal,